This has been one of the remarkable features that international competition for so long has been equal between men and women. It took a little bit longer with eventing, but not that much.
The envelope arrived without warning. No one expected what Princess Anne would do next. As she read the DNA report, her face went pale. Diana's name, an unknown child, decades of lies exposed in seconds. What happened next shocked the entire royal family. Anne's hands shook violently as the truth became undeniable.
And I think it says a lot for the sport in general, and a lot for horses in particular, that is entirely acceptable, and it works. And it works really well. You don't get people whinging about it.
The monarchy had hidden something catastrophic, and when Anne finally spoke, her words would tear down everything the crown had built. This wasn't just a scandal, this was the end of royal secrets forever. Princess Anne has spent her entire life immersed in the machinery of royal duty. She understands the weight of responsibility, the necessity of discretion, and the delicate balance required to maintain the dignity of the crown. On any other day, she would have passed this unmarked envelope to her private secretary without a second thought. But something about it demanded her attention. The weight felt different. The unmarked exterior seemed deliberately anonymous, as though someone had gone to great lengths to ensure it would slip through unnoticed while still reaching its intended recipient. When Anne broke the seal and began reading, the room around her seemed to contract. The document inside was clinical in its presentation, printed on official laboratory letterhead with the kind of precision that left no room for misinterpretation. There were no personal notes, no explanatory letters, just raw data presented in the stark language of genetic science. Her eyes moved down the page, expecting perhaps a misdirected medical report or an administrative error that had somehow found its way into the royal postal system. Then she saw the name Diana Spencer printed in black ink. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Her breath caught. Her hands, which had held countless documents with perfect composure over the years, began to tremble. Below Diana's name was another name, one that Anne did not recognize. It appeared nowhere in her memory of family trees, palace archives, or the extensive lineage she had been taught since childhood. This was not a name that belonged to any official record she had ever encountered. The conclusion printed at the bottom of the report was unambiguous. The laboratory had confirmed a genetic match between Diana and the individual named in the document. There were no qualifications, no suggestions of possible error, no language that left room for doubt. This was scientific certainty, delivered in the cold and methodical terms that laboratories use when they have verified their findings beyond question. Anne read the report again. Then she read it a third time. Her mind searched desperately for an explanation that would make this document less catastrophic than it appeared. Perhaps the file had been mislabeled. Perhaps someone had confused samples or made a clerical error in the chain of custody. But the more she read, the less plausible any alternative explanation became. Every line of data pointed to the same conclusion. Every genetic marker confirmed what the summary stated plainly. This was not speculation. This was not a rumor or tabloid conspiracy. This was documented proof of something that should not exist according to everything the public knew about Diana's life. The implications began to settle over Anne like a physical weight. The British monarchy, perhaps more than any other institution in the modern world, is built upon the foundation of bloodlines. Succession, legitimacy, and the entire narrative of continuity depend on an unbroken chain of documented lineage. The public may tolerate personal scandals and even forgive individual failings, but challenges to the fundamental structure of inheritance threaten the very concept of constitutional monarchy. This document represented exactly that kind of challenge. If Diana had a child who was not William or Harry, a child whose existence had been hidden from public knowledge, then the carefully maintained story of the royal family contained a gap that someone had deliberately concealed. The questions multiplied in Anne's mind faster than she could process them. Who knew about this? When did it happen? Why was it hidden? And most pressingly, why was she receiving this information now, years after Diana's death? The choice to send this report to Anne specifically felt deliberate. Among the senior members of the royal family, Anne has built a reputation for pragmatism and resilience. She does not court public attention or engage in the kind of personal drama that has plagued other royals. She performs her duties with military precision and has earned respect for her no-nonsense approach to royal responsibility. Someone had decided that Anne, rather than Charles or any other family member, should be the one to receive this information. That choice suggested calculation rather than accident. Anne folded the report carefully and locked it in her private drawer, turning the key with fingers that still trembled slightly. But even as the physical document disappeared from view, she understood that the knowledge could not be contained so easily. The palace around her felt different now, as though the walls themselves held secrets she was only beginning to understand. The silence in her office seemed unnaturally thick, weighted with decades of unspoken history. For the first time in her life, Princess Anne felt the ground beneath the monarchy shift. In a way that could not be corrected through duty or discipline. She had always believed in the institution she served. She had sacrificed personal freedom and lived according to rules that governed every aspect of her existence because she believed those rules protected something larger than any individual. But this document suggested that the institution had protected itself through deception, and that deception involved Diana, a woman whose relationship with the royal family had already been complicated and tragic. Anne sat alone in her office as afternoon chanced. Light filtered through the windows. Outside, life continued as it always did. Staff moved through corridors, official business proceeded according to schedule, and the carefully choreographed performance of royal life maintained its rhythm. But inside that locked drawer, a piece of paper held information that could alter everything. The report was only the beginning. Anne understood that much already. Someone had sent this to her for a reason, and that reason was not simply to inform her of a historical fact. This was an opening move in something larger, though she could not yet see the full shape of what was coming. She did not know yet that Diana had left behind more than just this laboratory report. She did not know about the letters, the journal entries, or the carefully scattered clues that Diana had planted like seeds, waiting for someone to finally understand what she had been trying to say all along. Anne only knew that the past, which she had believed was settled and understood, had suddenly become unstable. And somewhere in the distance between what she had always believed and what this document proved, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. The hours following the discovery of the DNA report passed in a kind of suspended reality for Princess Anne. She moved through her scheduled obligations with the trained composure expected of her, but her mind remained fixed on the document locked away in her desk. Sleep that night came in fragments, interrupted by questions that had no easy answers. By morning, she had made a decision. If someone had sent her this information deliberately, then there must be more to find. And if Diana was connected to this secret, then perhaps Diana herself had left traces that no one had thought to look for properly. Anne had kept certain items from Diana over the years. Letters mostly, along with a few journal entries that had been passed to family members after her death. At the time, Anne had read them with a mixture of sympathy and discomfort. Diana's emotional state in her final years had been turbulent, her writings often raw and vulnerable in ways that made them difficult to revisit. Anne had stored these papers away, unable to discard them, but equally unable to examine them too closely. They represented a grief that felt too private, too painful to fully absorb. Now she retrieved them from storage with a different lens. What had once seemed like the scattered thoughts of a woman under enormous pressure might actually contain deliberate messages. Diana had lived under constant scrutiny, her every word and action analysed by media and palace observers alike. In such an environment, direct communication about certain topics would have been impossible. But Diana had been intelligent and resourceful. If she needed to document something dangerous, she would have found ways to hide it in plain sight. Anne spread the letters and journal pages across her desk. The handwriting was familiar, Diana's distinctive script that had graced thousands of official documents and personal notes. But this time, Anne read not for emotional content, but for hidden meaning. She looked for patterns, for phrases that seemed deliberately vague or oddly specific. Diana had always been careful with her words when it mattered, cloaking uncomfortable truths in metaphor and suggestion. One line appeared multiple times across different documents, phrased slightly differently but conveying the same essential meaning. There are truths too dangerous to survive contact with the crown. Anne had dismissed this as melodrama when she first read it, the kind of overwrought expression that Diana sometimes used when feeling trapped or misunderstood. But now the phrase resonated differently. It was not a melodrama. It was a warning, perhaps even a confession cloaked in abstract language. Another journal entry caught her attention. The page was dated from a period in the early 1990s when Diana had been increasingly isolated from the royal family. The margins contained a single word, circled twice with heavy pressure from the pen. Child. The word sat alone, disconnected from the rest of the text, as though Diana had written it and then immediately recognized she could say nothing more on the subject. It was not referring to William or Harry. The context made that clear. This was something else, someone else, a child whose existence Diana could acknowledge only through a single underlined word in a private journal. Anne began to see the pattern Diana had created. She had scattered fragments of truth across multiple documents, never saying enough in any one place to be clear, but leaving enough traces that someone who knew what to look for might eventually piece it together. It was a kind of insurance policy, a way of leaving a record without openly defying the forces that demanded her silence. Diana had been walking a line between the need to document her truth and the very real danger of speaking it aloud. The realization brought Anne to another document, a letter Diana had written to a trusted friend near the end of her life. The letter discussed the importance of keeping certain things safe, of preparing for a future moment when the full story could be told. At the time, Anne had assumed Diana was referring to William and Harry, to the burdens they would carry as they grew into their royal roles. But the language was too careful, too specific to be only about her sons. Diana was talking about protecting something else, someone else, until the moment came when the truth could no longer be suppressed. Anne remembered a conversation she had with Diana not long before her death. They had been at a family gathering, and afterward Diana had pulled her aside. The conversation had been brief and cryptic at the time, Diana speaking about the importance of documentation and the need to ensure that certain truths would survive regardless of what happened to her personally. Anne had interpreted it as paranoia, the result of years of hostile press coverage and internal family tension. But Diana had not been paranoid, she had been preparing. The more Anne examined these materials, the clearer it became that Diana had been operating under constraints that Anne had never fully appreciated. Every word Diana spoke was monitored. Her movements were tracked. Her relationships were scrutinized. In such an environment, honesty was not just difficult, but potentially dangerous. Diana had learned to communicate in code, to express herself through implication rather than direct statement. She had become a master of saying things without saying them, of leaving traces that could be interpreted multiple ways depending on who was reading. Anne's investigation led her beyond Diana's personal writings to the official palace archives. If Diana had given birth to a child in secret, there would have been logistical necessities that left some kind of trail. Medical care, travel, arrangements, accommodations during a pregnancy, these things could not happen without documentation, even if that documentation had been deliberately obscured. Anne began to search through records from the late 1980s and then early 1990s, cross-referencing Diana's public appearances with gaps in the official schedule. What she found was more revealing in what was missing than in what remained. Entire files from key periods had vanished. Pages had been removed from binding with enough care that casual observers might not notice the gaps. Dates that should have been accounted for were simply absent, as though weeks of Diana's life had been erased from the official record. In some cases, handwritten notes had been covered over with correction fluid and replaced with different text in ink that did not match the original entries. The pattern was too consistent to be accidental. Someone with access to the archives had gone through systematically removing or altering anything that might point to Diana's secret. It was not the work of a single person acting on impulse. This was institutional erasure, carried out with precision and resources that only the palace itself could mobilize. Anne had seen enough bureaucratic cover-ups in her decades of royal service to recognize the signature. This was how the institution protected itself when something threatened its carefully managed narrative. Then, buried in a secondary archive that stored records from royal medical consultations, Anne found a notation that made her pulse quicken. It was a reference to a European medical facility, a private clinic located in Switzerland. The entry was minimal, just a date and a location, but the date corresponded exactly to a period when Diana had been absent from public view, officially described as a private retreat for rest and recovery. The clinic specialized in discreet medical services for high-profile clients, the kind of place chosen not for its medicals. Excellence. but for its ability to guarantee absolute privacy. Anne traced the clinic's records as far as she could without alerting anyone to her investigation. She discovered that a doctor who had once been part of the Royal Medical Staff had been present at that facility during the exact time Diana was there. This doctor had served the royal family for years, trusted completely with the most sensitive health information. And then, within months of that Swiss visit, he had abruptly resigned from royal service. The official explanation cited personal reasons, a phrase so vague it could mean anything or nothing. The timing was too precise to ignore. Diana had travelled to Switzerland under the guise of a private retreat. A trusted palace doctor had been there at the same time. Shortly after, that doctor had left royal service permanently. And now, decades later, a DNA report confirmed that Diana had a child whose existence had been wiped from every official record. The pieces were coming, together forming a picture of deliberate concealment that reached the highest levels of the institution. Anne had served her entire life. She sat back in her chair, the weight of discovery pressing down on her. This was not a simple secret. It was an orchestrated erasure involving multiple people, coordinated timing, and resources that only the palace itself commanded. Diana had tried to leave a trail, scattering breadcrumbs through her writings in the desperate hope that someone would eventually follow them. And now, years after her death, Anne was finally seeing what Diana had been trying to show all along. The evidence Anne had gathered left little room for doubt, but it raised a question that she could no longer avoid. If this child existed, if Diana had given birth in secret and the truth had been systematically erased, then someone in the family must have known. The scale of the cover-up was too large, too coordinated to have happened without authorization from the highest levels. And that meant confronting the one person who would have had both the knowledge and the authority to make such a decision. Anne requested a private meeting with Charles, framing it as a discussion of family matters that required discretion. They met in one of the smaller private rooms at the palace, away from staff and official observers. She brought the DNA report with her, placing it on the table between them without preamble or explanation. For a long moment, Charles simply looked at the document without touching it, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, it was not to question the validity of the report or to express surprise at its contents. He looked at Anne with a kind of tired resignation and said simply that, yes, the child was real. There was no shock in his voice, no confusion about what he was seeing. He had known. The admission hung in the air between them, transforming everything Anne thought she understood about her family and the institution they served. Charles explained in a voice stripped of emotion that after Diana's death, a decision had been made. He did not use the word conspiracy or cover-up. He called it a necessary arrangement, a pact formed among a small group of trusted advisors and family members who understood what was at stake. The monarchy had been under enormous pressure in the years following Diana's death. Public opinion had turned sharply against the royal family. Trust had been damaged in ways that would take decades to repair. In that fragile moment, the revelation of a secret child would have been catastrophic. Anne listened in growing disbelief as her brother described the reasoning that had justified erasing a child from existence. The monarchy could not survive another complication to the line of succession, Charles explained. William and Harry's positions were clear and legally established, but another child, particularly one born under circumstances that were not entirely clear, would raise questions that the institution was not prepared to answer. It would invite speculation about Diana's relationships, about the timing of the pregnancy, about who the father might be. Every aspect of the situation contained potential for scandal that could undermine the careful work of restoring public confidence in the crown. So they had made a choice, Charles said. The child would be protected financially, provided for through discreet channels that could never be traced back to the palace. He would be raised far from public attention, given a life outside the impossible pressure of royal expectations. But he would never be acknowledged. His existence would remain buried, his connection to Diana erased from every record that mattered. Charles spoke of this decision as though it had been pragmatic, even compassionate in its own way. The child would have a normal life, free from the burdens that had destroyed his mother. Anne felt something break inside her as she listened. She asked the question that seemed most obvious and most damning. Why had no one protected Diana while she was alive? Why had they allowed her to suffer through isolation and public humiliation, knowing that she carried this impossible secret? Charles did not have an answer that satisfied her. He spoke instead of competing pressures, of institutional requirements that took precedence over individual needs. The monarchy demanded certain sacrifices, he said, and Diana had understood that when she married into the family. But Anne was not interested in justifications wrapped in duty and tradition. She wanted to know how Charles could live with himself, knowing that he had stood by while the truth was buried, along with the woman who had tried so desperately to protect it. She accused him of cowardice, of choosing the crown over basic human decency. Her voice rose in a way that was entirely unlike her usual controlled demeanor. Years of suppressed frustration poured out, directed not just at this specific betrayal, but at the entire system of silence and complicity that had made it possible. Charles remained composed, his face a mask of practiced restraint. He did not apologize. He did not express regret. He simply maintained that given the circumstances, given the pressures of that moment, the decision had been necessary. The survival of the monarchy required difficult choices. Personal feelings, however valid, could not be allowed to override institutional stability. Anne realized then that she was not going to find remorse or second thoughts. Her brother had made peace with what he had done, convinced that history would vindicate the choice even if it looked cruel in the present moment. The conversation ended without resolution. Anne left the room feeling as though she had lost something fundamental. Not just her trust in Charles, but her faith in the institution she had served without question for her entire life. She had believed that beneath all the pageantry and protocol, the royal family still operated according to basic principles of integrity. That belief was now shattered beyond repair. But Charles was not the only person who had known. Anne's investigation had revealed that others within the palace inner circle had been aware of the secret, and one name kept surfacing with uncomfortable frequency. Camilla had been present during the critical years when the cover-up was orchestrated. She had been close to Charles throughout the period when decisions were being made about how to handle Diana's secret, and if anyone understood how information could be used as leverage within the palace, it was Camilla. Anne arranged a meeting with Camilla, expecting denials or carefully constructed ignorance. Instead, she found something far more unsettling. Camilla admitted without hesitation that she had known about the child for years, not because Charles had told her directly, but because she had made it her business to know. Information was currency in the palace, and Camilla had always been skilled at collecting valuable pieces and holding them until the right moment. She spoke of the discovery almost casually, describing how fragments of conversation and half-hidden documents had eventually revealed the full picture. Camilla had never needed official confirmation. She had assembled the truth from whispers and implications, from the careful way certain topics were avoided and the suspicious gaps in official records. And once she knew, she had kept that knowledge close, recognizing its value as leverage that never needed to be exercised openly to be effective. Anne tried to push past the veneer of calm sophistication, demanding to know how Camilla could live with such knowledge while watching the royal family present a sanitized version of history to the world. But Camilla was unmoved by moral arguments. She explained with chilling practicality that the palace operated according to rules Anne was only beginning to understand. Truth was not a virtue in this environment. Truth was a weapon, and the person who held it without revealing it possessed more power than the person who spoke it aloud. Camilla suggested that Anne was naive if she thought she was the only one who had discovered Diana's secret over the years. Others knew, or suspected, or had been given enough information to piece it together. But they had remained silent, not because they were ordered to, but because silence served their interests. The system rewarded discretion and punished honesty. Speaking up would have accomplished nothing except to make the speaker vulnerable. So, people learned to hold their secrets, to use them as protection rather than confession. The conversation took a darker turn when Camilla leaned forward and spoke in a near whisper. She told Anne that the child Diana had hidden was not a distant memory or an abstract moral question. He was real, and he was closer than Anne might imagine. The words carried a weight that Anne felt physically. This was not speculation or rumor. Camilla knew where he was, or at least knew enough to confirm that he was still alive and living somewhere within reach. Anne demanded more information, but Camilla simply smiled and suggested that perhaps Anne should ask herself why this information was surfacing now, years after Diana's death. Someone wanted this secret exposed, and they had chosen Anne as the instrument. Camilla warned that pursuing this path would have consequences that extended far beyond personal revelation. The monarchy was fragile in ways the public did not see. Exposing this truth would not just embarrass the institution, it would call into question the entire foundation of legitimacy that the crown depended on. But even as Camilla spoke her warnings, Anne understood that the choice had already been made. She could not return to ignorance. She could not pretend that the DNA report did not exist, or that Diana's scattered breadcrumbs had not led her to this moment. The past was not going to stay buried, regardless of who wanted it to remain hidden. And if this man, Diana's son, was truly out there living in enforced anonymity, then he deserved to have his existence acknowledged. Anne left the meeting with Camilla feeling more determined than she had before. The warnings and threats had clarified something essential. The people who had buried this truth were afraid of what would happen if it emerged. That fear meant the truth had power. And for the first time in her life, Anne was prepared to use that power, regardless of the cost to the institution she had always served. The knowledge that Diana's son existed and was living somewhere within reach consumed Anne in the days that followed her confrontations with Charles and Camilla. She could not return to the comfortable distance of palace routine, could not pretend that the weight of this secret was someone else's burden to carry. Diana had left breadcrumbs hoping someone would follow them, and Anne had followed them to a truth that demanded action. But finding a man who had been deliberately erased from every official record would require resources and discretion that the palace itself could not provide. Anne turned to private investigators, carefully selected individuals who had no connection to the royal family and no reason to report back to palace authorities. She provided them with the fragments she had assembled. The dates from Diana's unexplained absences, the location of the Swiss clinic, the timeline that had emerged from her investigation of the archives. She gave them the name from the day report, the initials that had appeared in that single medical ledger. And then she waited, understanding that if this man had survived decades of enforced anonymity, he had learned to hide himself well. The search took weeks. Information came back in pieces, each one adding detail to a picture that had been deliberately obscured. Diana's trip to Switzerland had indeed coincided with a stay at a private medicals facility known for serving high-profile clients who required absolute discretion. Records from that facility, obtained through channels Anne did not ask about, confirmed that a child had been born there during the exact period Diana had been away from public view. The birth had been registered under a false name, with no father listed and no indication of the mother's true identity. The child had been placed with a family shortly after birth, not through official adoption channels, but through private arrangements that left no legal trail. Money had changed hands, enough to ensure comfortable living conditions and education, but delivered through intermediaries who could never be connected back to their source. The boy had grown up knowing he was different, that there were secrets surrounding his origins, but without any clear understanding of who he really was, or why his life was structured around such careful distance from anything public. When the investigators finally located him, they sent Anne a photograph before making contact. She opened the file on her computer in the privacy of her office, not knowing what to expect. The face that appeared on the screen stopped her breath. It was not just resemblance, it was recognition. He had Diana's eyes, the same intense gaze that had captivated millions. The shape of his face, the line of his jaw, even the way he held himself in the photograph carried echoes of the woman Anne had known. There was no mistaking the connection. But beyond the physical resemblance, there was something else in his expression that struck Anne deeply. He looked guarded, watchful, as though he had learned early that trust was a luxury he could not afford. The photograph showed a man in his 30s, dressed simply, standing in what appeared to be an ordinary street in a European city. There was nothing remarkable about the setting or his appearance, and that was precisely the point. He had built a life designed to be unremarkable, to blend in, rather than stand out. Anne arranged a meeting through the investigators, making it clear that the approach had to be careful. This man had spent his entire life in hiding. Suddenly confronting him with the truth of his identity could be traumatic, even dangerous if he chose to reject the information or if word leaked before Anne was prepared to act. The meeting was set in a neutral location, a private residence in a quiet neighborhood where they could talk without risk of observation. When Anne finally sat across from him, the reality of the moment overwhelmed her careful preparations. She had planned what she would say, how she would explain who she was and why she had sought him out. But the words seemed inadequate for the enormity of what she needed to communicate. So she began simply introducing herself and acknowledging that he probably had questions about why a member of the royal family had tracked him down after so many years of silence. He did not seem surprised. That was the first thing that struck her. He looked at her with recognition, not of her face but of the situation. He had been waiting for this moment, perhaps not knowing when it would come or who would be the one to finally speak the truth aloud, but understanding that eventually someone would. He told her that he had known for years who his mother was, not from official sources or family revelation, but from the fragments Diana herself had left behind. He described a childhood marked by careful boundaries and unexplained restrictions. The family that raised him had been kind but distant, performing a role rather than building genuine connection. There had been visitors over the years, people who came with money and instructions, who asked questions about his health and education, but never about his feelings or his understanding of his own life. He had learned not to ask too many questions, sensing that certain topics were forbidden, not by rule but by an unspoken agreement that everyone around him seemed to understand except him. Then, when he was in his late teens, a letter had arrived. It was not sent through normal postal channels but delivered by hand, passed to him by someone who disappeared before he could ask questions. The letter was in handwriting he did not recognize at the time, but the words were unmistakable. Diana had written to him, explaining as much as she dared within the constraints of what was safe to commit to paper. She told him that she was his mother, that she had never wanted to be separated from him, and that circumstances beyond her control had made it impossible for her to claim him publicly. The letter did not explain everything. It could not, but it gave him enough to begin understanding the shape of his own life. Diana had written other letters over the years, he told Anne, each one delivered through circuitous routes designed to avoid detection. She had never been able to speak to him directly or see him in person, but she had maintained contact in the only way available to her. When Diana died, those letters stopped. He had been in his early 20s, old enough to understand what her death meant for any possibility of ever meeting her. The loss had not been like losing a mother he had known. It was the loss of a future that might have been, a relationship that had existed only in carefully coded letters, and the imagination of what could have happened if circumstances were different. He spoke of this with surprising calm, as though he had long ago made peace with a situation he could not change. Anne found herself apologizing, though she knew the words were inadequate. She apologized for the years of silence, for the system that had made him invisible, for the family that had chosen institutional survival over acknowledging his right to exist openly. And then, with tears she had not expected and could not control, she told him that she would not allow the silence to continue.